Hello everyone, and this is Hawk back again with more sound design. Are you a game developer and have always wondered how big game studios like EA and Sony make their action scenes sound like this?
I hired the right pilot, that's for sure.
Hostile group sighted!
Well, not to worry, my intrepid sound explorers. Making a heavy action sequence or an impactful weapon effect can be tricky, but today we will be going over some of what I know and what I learned by explaining how I did my recent audio redesign for Battlefield 6, released in 2025. For those who do not know, Battlefield 6 is an FPS game released by the EA developer Battlefield Studios. If you know what Call of Duty is, think of Call of Duty but bigger and with much larger maps and way more people in every match. Personally, I think it's one of the most fun games I've ever had the chance to play, and it features some crazy weapon sounds. Now, if you haven't had a chance yet to watch my redesign for Battlefield 6, I'd highly recommend going and checking it out. A lot of what we're going to be going over is going to make a lot more sense once you've had a chance to view the final product. And it will give you a better idea of how I attained those sounds in the first place. It would really mean a lot. I put a lot of effort into it, so please go check it out here. Now with that, let's get into the breakdown. Now, if you've watched any of my previous content, you know I like to start out most projects with my BGs. BG stands for backgrounds and is the ambient sounds in a film or game that make the scene sound like you are on location. For example, making a city sound like a city, a forest sound like a forest, or my office sound like a place where I spend most of my life playing with air vibrations. It really brings the whole scene together and gives you a great foundation to build the rest of the sounds on. Not everyone does it this way to start, but it's just the way I prefer how to do it. Now, when making your BGs, it's really important to pay very close attention to the scene you are working on. This goes for both games and film. What is around you? How much action and movement is there in the environment? How would this space sound in terms of reverberation and the spatial size? We can see we are in a very sandy desert town. There is most likely going to be the sounds of sand in the wind, and the space is very open. Most of the clip takes place either outdoors or in a very destroyed house that might as well be outdoors as well, for how much destruction we see happening. There is also a very large battle happening right now, so I might be adding in some ambient warfare sound to this BG as well, but we'll discuss that more later. We also want to consider the fact that this town obviously does not have any civilian activity. There's nobody walking around and shopping, there's no cars on the roads, and no busy markets. It's deserted and been left for war. Now, we want to reflect all of those details somewhat in our ambience. For this, I combined a collection of desert winds, abandoned locations, battles, and some extra characters like this shipyard. Even though we are not in a shipyard or anywhere near one, the darker and more tonal aspects of this track increase the tension in our surroundings, adding to our scene. Let's listen to these all separately. And now let's listen to them together. Now, this final product really suits our overall space. If we were producing this for a video game, this would be what we would use as our 2D ambience bed. However, since I'm working to a video clip, this will act as our standard BG. Notice how, even though I added the war sounds in, such as distant gunshots and explosions, these are very quiet. This is because you don't want your ambiences to stand out. They are there to bring life to the space and not dominate it, so you want to keep the action in them to a minimum. We will be adding more ambient effects later in our effects mix to bring the scene further to life from there. You'll also notice on the bottom here we have some surround sound tracks. Now this can be very useful when working with clients that may want a 5:1 mix when it comes to video editing, and you can easily down mix to stereo from here if you need to. Now let's talk about what was personally my favorite part of this project by far, the Foley. When we look at this particular project, we need to factor in the style of game and the gameplay itself by researching some different content. This can be a very strong tool for furthering your sound skills. When we look at similar games, you'll notice there's a lot of detailed movement sounds. The footsteps can sound heavy to reflect all the war gear they have on. We can hear the movement of their guns and other weapons, as well as belt clips, and more exaggerated sounds such as jumping, landing, throwing items, and weapon reloads. All of these are in our clip of choice as well. Now for Foley, I like to start with footsteps. This will help us sync a lot of our movement sounds later on, such as the cloths and the equipment rattles. And keep in mind, we are making sounds for an infantry soldier, wearing a lot of heavy gear and most likely combat boots. Unless this character is using some sort of freaky Call of Duty skin. We'll also want to note that during the clip, the player moves from a concrete or stone flooring up onto wooden stairs and a wooden floor on the second floor of the building. So we will need two different types of materials for the footsteps overall. Now, when it comes to footsteps, you can do a lot in your home studio so long as you have the right shoes and the right material. Unfortunately, I don't have any combat boots kicking around, and I just couldn't find the right concrete thump that I was looking for in my own house without them. So I resorted to some sample libraries, which are very useful when it comes to Foley. You can find a lot of great Foley samples on places such as Pro Sound Effect or A Sound Effect. And overall, they can be very useful, and you get a lot of bang for your buck since they can be reused in a lot of different places. Now don't forget to add in some heavier sounds for when the character is jumping or landing, especially near the end of the clip. Now we also need some cloth movement. And again, when it comes to Foley, never underestimate what you can do in your own home office or studio. When doing Foley for this, I looked all around my house for good material and found this old fabric bag full of cables. Turns out it worked perfectly, although you will look a little goofy when you're shaking it around, trying to match what you see on the screen. You can also change the quality of the sound by adding or removing certain items from what you're handling. For example, in some takes, I taped down the zippers on the bag to avoid that sort of high-pitched rattle they were making. And in other cases, I added extra items inside the bag to increase the weight and gear sound of the effect. After doing a few different passes, all you'll really need to do is edit the audio to match the movement on screen and the footsteps, which we've already done, which eventually leaves you with this. Now, some of it may sound a little out of place without all the other effects there to help glue things together, but trust the process, we'll get there eventually. Lastly, we need some mechanical sounds. We can see that the rocket launcher itself gets fired and reloaded a few times, and we also look down the sights of the rocket launcher and the SMG a couple of times. Adding some mechanical gun foley to these will emphasize those actions to the player, and will also add just a touch of realism. For these, I didn't have very many of my own materials that sounded just right, so I used a collection of samples that fit the scene. Don't be afraid to try a few different ones until you get something that fits. That gave us this. On its own, again, it doesn't sound like much, but again, we have to trust the process. Foley is one of those things that you don't really pay much attention to when you're watching a piece of media. It's just something that your ears expect to be there, and when it fits, you don't even notice it, and it sounds amazing. For example, let's hear how it sounds with all of our other Foley that we made previously. Maybe now you can see why the Foley for this one was my favorite. It just sounds amazing. But with all that out of the way, now it's time to get into some of the heavy work. We have to do these sound effects. This clip has a lot of effects to design and cut. Let's just give it a quick watch and make a short list. If I'm being honest, this is where I was thinking this might be a bit more than I can do with the time I had allotted myself for this project. But it's too late to turn back, so let's get into it. Some of these can be grouped together and handled at the same time, like all the different RPG sounds, all the tank sounds, and all of the ambient sounds. This is going to make it a little easier because we can compartmentalize these tasks. Let's start with the RPG, which is definitely going to be the most important sound for this clip. This is mainly because it's a player weapon, and so we want to make it big, very explosive, give it that impact and responsiveness that we need. Since this is a real-world weapon, we also have the benefit of being able to research it a bit beforehand and learn how it works, as well as how it sounds in real life. Most weapons sound a lot different in real life than they do in video games and other media. However, it gives us a great starting point, as well as helps us ensure that it sounds accurate. If the weapon doesn't sound accurate or similar to what people might expect it to sound like in real life, then players might get pulled out of the immersion of the game. When designing any firearm, it's also important to focus on what most people would consider to be the three main parts of any major weapon effect, such as the rocket launcher. Those would be the transient, the body, and the tail. These three components are usually what make the base of a great weapon sound. After that, you can often add any sort of extra detail layers that you might need as you need them. I'm not gonna lie, this rocket launcher gave me a bit of trouble, but after about 2 or 3 hours of playing around with different effects and sounds, these were what some of my choices ended up being. You can see we added in a lot of mechanical and more sharp sounds at the very start for the transient, a lot of heavy sort of kicks and whooshes in the middle to help flesh out the body, and then we have a lot of heavy explosions as well to flesh out the tail. Now, I also added in a fair amount of little fire magics and little whooshes. This is mostly there to help express when the rocket is launching out of the tube away from the player. And together with the help of a little processing, we get this. Never forget to clean up the sounds as you're making them. A bit of EQ and selective compression on specific layers can really help certain parts of the sound from drowning out others, or prevent you from falling into the classic trap of your sound becoming way too mid-heavy. Now, since this is a rocket launcher, we also need a sound effect for the rocket itself flying away. We added a little bit of this into the weapon effect itself, but if we were designing for a game or just wanted more control of the sound itself in a film, we might want to make a separate sound layer just for this. In this case, I just wanted a little bit of extra volume and detail to the sound of the rocket booster itself, lighting, and flying away. And now, of course, we also need a sound for the rocket exploding in the distance. Now, if we were designing sounds for a game engine, we would want to make sure that the explosion sounds have different layers created for them based on distance, with different rocket impact sounds being cross-faded together based on how far away the explosion is occurring from us. Luckily, in this clip, all of the explosions from our rocket launcher are happening at roughly the same distance, so we don't need to modify them very much. Something we will need to watch out for, though, is the material the rocket is impacting. All these shots are hitting the same tank in the distance, so we want to make sure that that detail is reflected in our sound. Once again, keep in mind we want to design the transient body and tail of the sound, since we are hitting a large metal vehicle and want some more impactful sounds. Hits, explosion layers, and other options are all on the table. And after, again, a bit more mixing, we get this. And lastly for the rocket, we have the reload. Now, part of this we handled in our Foley with the cloth and the mechanical layers. Already, we've brought a little bit of interest to this detail, but we need the main body of the sound, the meat and potatoes. When doing reloads, something that can really help is to study the gun itself and how the actual object is handled in real life. In this case, I couldn't find the actual model of the weapon that is used in this clip, so I was only able to work with the animation itself, but I was able to do a little bit of research on how most rocket launchers are handled in terms of reloads. We can see the rocket itself being slid into the tube of the launcher in 2 swift movements, and from a bit of research we can learn that this actually slides into a locking mechanism inside of the rocket tube. From that, we can infer or make a lot of new sonic details that will add interest and character to the sound. From here, I broke down the sound into the grind of metal on metal, the mechanical elements, and a little something extra for the second movement since it was stronger and it finished the action. So we wanted to accentuate this a little more. And altogether, we get something that I think sounds pretty realistic. Something I learned when first doing weapons and game audio was it's very useful when using recorded libraries for things like this to pick samples out that you can find a variety of similar options in. For example, the Meg option I use here has a large number of variations of the same sound. If we extend the audio file out, this means that if we need to build variations in our reload sound and make each one sound a little more unique and natural, we can use the variations in some of our samples to achieve this cleanly. Now let's take a look at that tank. Now for the tank, we need the sound of it firing, the sound of its shells impacting near the player, as well as the sound of it moving. Since it fires a lot in this clip, let's see how we accomplish that. Once again, we want to focus on transient body and tail, but the tank cannon is both further away from the player and more powerful when compared to the rocket launcher. So somehow we need to make it both more powerful and a bit weaker because of the distance. How can we accomplish that? It all really comes down to sample choice and processing. Weapon libraries are some of the few that most sound designers will have to spend a bit of money on, since recording weapons themselves is both very difficult and very expensive. So we need to find the right collection of samples to make it work. For this, I went with a deep digital kick for the body to give it that big artillery punch we were looking for. On top of that, I added some aircraft cannon samples for the shorter transient and the tail from a howitzer and an old smoothbore cannon. You will also notice I have it offset a bit, with the body happening slightly after the start of the transient samples and the tail also coming in later, especially that howitzer sample at the bottom. This is a bit of a design trick, which can help thicken out the transient to some degree and add some sonic detail to the effect. We will look at that in a moment. Here are all the individual layers. And when we put them all together, And of course, we're going to use that trick I just mentioned for making variations to fill out the rest of the sounds. And lastly, here's an example of how it would sound different if we had lined everything up so that it started and played at the same time. Once again, I cannot emphasize how important it is to add a bit of processing to these as you're working on them to keep them from getting too muddled in the mid-range and keep these transients under control. Transient control is extremely important for any sort of weapon or explosion sound. Now for the shell impacts, again, we follow a similar process, except this time we need to worry about debris and shrapnel. Explosions tend to blow a lot of small bits of things all over the place, which is why they sound so destructive and powerful in most media. Let's add in our main explosion sounds, and then just a sprinkle of dirt, sand, and concrete for our debris. Altogether, that leaves us with this. And the last element of the tank we need is the engine. Usually vehicles can be quite complex to cut for sound designers, but this one was thankfully quite simple. When designing for tank movements, we want to keep in mind the material the tank is driving on, the sound of the engine itself, and the sound of the treads moving. Since we are so far away though from this tank, we reasonably don't have to plan out for the material layer just yet. Those are mostly prominent on close layers, say if our character was walking right beside the tank. This means, in this case, it boils down to just finding a really good engine sound and some nice rattly treads. Combine them, add a fair amount of panning and distance attenuation, and we have a working tank. Now let's talk about hit markers. Hit markers are little icons that pop up in a lot of FPS and shooter games to tell the player that their shot connected. These are usually very short, very compressed, and a bit stylized to match the game they are in. Let's make something tight and impactful by combining some punches, and why not? Let's throw in some soda cans. Now, as you can see from the very extensive list of plugins on the left side here, this is heavily processed. These are all there to help control the frequency range of the overall sound as well as the transient. Hit markers will have a fair amount of saturation added in a lot of cases, and more high-end detail since they overlay with a lot of other sounds such as bullet impacts, explosions, and bass-heavy nonsense. Congrats if you followed along this far because we are almost done. Now we just have to add in some ambient warfare sounds to bring some more action into the space. Some extra effects for the more impactful movements like lunging over the wall, landing, and our throw of the grenade. And we can't forget those artillery strikes halfway through our clip. For those, we will follow a similar thought process to the tank shell impacts, but keep in mind the difference in ordnance that would have been used, and the various impacts that we see. Since this is most likely some kind of artillery or aerial strike, it's also great feedback for the players if you add a bit of a whoosh or incoming shell screech for the actual impact to simulate the shell whizzing through the air before impact. For example, this is what it would sound like without the whoosh. Not quite as interesting or realistic. Whew, that was a lot. Thankfully, now it's time to mix. If we were working in a game engine or middleware integration, this would be a lot of fun since we can be adding in a lot of programs to handle our spatial audio. This would essentially make it so if an explosion happened to our left, we'd hear it to our left. This is another reason most effects are mono instead of stereo, since there isn't really any such thing as a true stereo effect in real life. However, since we are doing this all to a video clip, we will have to do some very fancy panning and a lot of volume automation. If you're doing something similar, give yourself a bit of patience and trust your ears. And also, I'd recommend making sure you're watching the actual video while you're mixing and adjusting from there to make sure that everything matches visually and in terms of audio to what you're seeing. This will really help you narrow in the sounds in terms of distance and location. And now we can finally play our final piece. I hope you guys really enjoyed following along with this. This project was honestly pretty fun to make, and I loved watching it come together while I was working on it. I hope this breakdown also helps a lot of others when it comes to similar sound design projects that they are working on. Are you a game developer or a filmmaker and want great audio for your project like this? Well then, leave a comment below and let's connect. I'd actually really love to hear about your project, what you're doing, and how you're going about it. You can also find more of my videos here if you want to hear some more of my work. We'll see you guys next time, and thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.